very much. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Corinne. And thank you very much for inviting me to do this presentation. I'm going to talk about the research I do, at least some parts of it, having to do with people with dementia as storytellers, and that connects to what Corinne indicated with broken stories, incoherent stories, and so on. And that's been a quite long-standing interest of mine to look at the way people with quite severe dementia actually still can either tell stories or participate in storytelling events. But before I proceed, let me say something very briefly about dementia. Dementia is a progressive brain disease that hits various parts of the brain. It results in linguistic and cognitive challenges or loss of functions. Basically, and eventually dementia results in death. Although it's a disease with many phases, some subgroups of dementia has to do with neurodegenerative mechanism, that is, parts of the nerve cells actually dies, and the connections between the nerve cells. Other subgroups of dementia has to do with rather the result of stroke. It's called vascular dementia. So, although we generally talk about dementia, it's actually quite a varied disease with quite many phases. I've been quite interested in what's called Alzheimer's disease. It's the largest group of the dementia diseases, and it's a neurodegenerative disease. So it starts in those parts of the brain that are connected either with language, that's the temporal lobe, or with memory, it's subcortical structures in the brain, which means that people affected by Alzheimer's disease will have problems telling stories about shared memories, both because they have problems using their memories, but also because they will have problems using language. So for me, with my interest in storytelling, in conversational storytelling, Alzheimer's disease is a quite interesting disease, because then the question is, if your brain is sort of breaking down, what do you do when you are trying to tell stories? And I'm also interested in stories because stories are ubiquitous. You find them everywhere. And storytelling is also very important as a way both to present and negotiate identities in interaction with other people. And in many ways, narratives are also important in understanding both other persons, what they intend to do, what they are doing, but also in more general terms, understanding the world. Now, from my perspective, research on dementia invites us to rethink many theoretical issues. That's one of the key motives for me to do research on dementia. But here today I'm going to focus on two things. The more general question, what is memory? And the background for that is that in the traditional experimental psychology, modern cognitive psychology, memory is quite often thought of in terms of being an archive. That's the term a colleague of mine, Jens Brockmeyer, introduced, the metaphor of memory as an archive. The general idea is that somewhere in the brain there are sort of images, small video snippets, photos, whatever, of events in the past. And the problem is to sort of find them and then get them out of the brain, so to say, so you can sort of communicate them. That's sort of the classical, traditional view of memory. And that's also an idea of memory that have been quite challenged the last couple of decades. I'll come back to that. But in connection to the question, is memory an archive or is it something else? Then, of course, it also becomes quite interesting when people are losing memory. You know, they're supposed to forget things or not being able to retrieve memories from the archive. So, and I think both these ideas and conceptions of memory and loss of memory in many ways are challenged by much of the new research on dementia. The classical idea in memory research is that we sort of store, in the archive, we store representations of event, and generally thought a special part of the memory called the episodic memory. And the event representation is a very abstract representation. It has nothing to do with experience, it has nothing to do with our senses, either smell or touch or movement. It's sort of a very abstract representation of events. When we sort of remember things, we retrieve that event, and then in another part of memory, we sort of maps that event into linguistic structures that are stored again in a kind of archive in what's called the semantic memory. And the semantic memory also stores rules for storytelling, for instance. And then out comes talk. So to talk in this perspective, talk about memories are mapped linguistic structures on abstract cognitive representations of events. And when you suffer from dementia, either that memory or that memory is hit. So you will have problem either retrieving events or putting them into words, and out comes mumble jumble or something, you know, that doesn't work. Now, quite a few researchers working in the field of dementia has challenged this traditional idea about memory as an archive and different archives that are interconnected. And the main reason is that much of the traditional archive metaphor is based on experimental research, which means that you take a person with dementia and puts him or her before a computer screen and makes some kind, in order to make some test and in order to remember certain words or numbers or whatever. The problem is if you sort of observe people with dementia in real life, in everyday situations, interacting with people they know, spouses, children, other family members, it turns out that people with dementia can be quite good at remembering things, even sort of finding words if they get some help from others, for instance. If the spouse helps with finding a specific word or helps by putting certain questions, helps the person with dementia to sort of to identify the memory they are talking about. So in a way, comparing everyday situations, conversational situations, with the classical experimental paradigm, you know, it doesn't work really. It seems that people with dementia actually are able to do more than they are supposed to be able to do inside the experimental paradigm. And in order to conceptualize what goes on in conversational interaction, quite a few researchers has the last maybe 10, 20 years began talking about and using the concept embodiment. And in doing that, they sort of widened the classical idea what a body is. By tradition, the traditional body sociology from the 1920s and 30s generally thought of the body as the body, but then as philosophers, anthropologists, psychologists, and so on started to investigate embodiment the last 20 years, it sort of also became widened to encompass also bodily experiences of various kinds. And in this presentation here today, I will focus on two specific types of embodiment. First, the way persons actually use their body, their actual physical body, in order to communicate as a kind of alternative semiotic tool, as a way of making sense by not using language, but by using their actual body. In this case, eyes and hands primarily. But I will also be looking at what's called embodied cognition, which is an idea that challenges the traditional archive idea. Because in the archive idea about memory, all memories are sort of stripped of their experiential quality and become some kind of quite abstract representation. But quite a few, especially cognitive psychologists, have been pointing out, and also neuroscientists has been pointed out, is that it seems that memories of things we did in the past may be connected to motoric centers in our brain. So when we remember things we did as kids, when we played, and if you look at the brain and you ask people, could you remember, playing softball or whatever you did as a kid, and then they put an MRI camera on your brain, and they can see that when people are talking about moving around physically, walking, running and so on, certain areas in the brain connected with movement, the motoric areas, are highlighted. The same when people use words like walking, it's the same center of the brain that is activated. And that, in a way, challenges the idea that memories are not connected to quite concrete experiential aspects of memories. So that is also something I hope I can show you. And I would like to look at the way a person, my example is going to be a person who is telling a story. She's telling about what happened to her when she began to discover that she had dementia. And we are going to look at a very brief sequence from a video and see how she, and you will see she has problems using language, and you will see how she starts to use gestures and especially also her eyes. But if we look closely at the gestures, we'll see that some of these gestures probably are connected to the specific quality of the memories she are talking about. So, my example is about a woman called Laura. She's 52 years old when I'm interviewing her. She has what is called early onset dementia. She was just roughly 45 years of age when she at first was diagnosed with dementia. So she's been living with dementia for roughly 5-6 years something. And she's in a late middle stage of dementia. So she's beginning to lose her ability to remember things like where she lives and finding her way back. She has quite severe problems finding words and so on, and you will see that later on. She also has 2 children, one old daughter that is married, and a younger son who she will talk about in the example. She's also divorced. When she got her diagnosis, her husband divorced her, so the home broke up with the children and she had to move away. She's part of a larger, she was actually part of a pilot study we did in a larger project about couples in which one spouse has developed dementia. We are following 15 couples over time, doing repeated interviews with them, and focus on joint storytelling, and especially storytelling about their own life, because that's sort of interesting. Because when you tell your life story, or your stories as a married couple, you have to remember and discuss things like identity, shared experiences, and so on. And we all know that if someone dies who has been part of shared memories, that sort of affects us, because when someone dies or will have problems remembering things, we lose a bit of ourselves. So that's the thing we are sort of interested in following. So we are doing interviews with couples, and it's thematic interviews. We ask about diagnosis, life history, present life, and so on. And normally we do this with couples, but in Laura's case, she's divorced. So when we did this interview, she had a social support person present. That was her choice. We asked her, do you want your son or daughter or whatever, but she has a social support person. So and we made the interview in Laura's home, and we are two interviewers, myself and a colleague of mine, and we used video, so we video recorded the interviews. And this is the setup. This is Laura, this is her social support person, and the quality is intentionally bad in order for you not to be able to recognize the persons. So I've sort of fixed with the photos and videos. So they are, Laura and her support person are sitting in a sofa with a table in front of them. That's the thing for the TV. Yeah. And I'm sitting here. My colleague is sitting here, and she's looking at me because I'm the lead interviewer. So I pose the first question. So her gaze is directed towards me, and this is we're going to look at a very brief sequence, 21 seconds, and this person is never involved in this sequence, so we sort of let her be in the back. So this sequence is about 5-10 minutes into the interview, and Laura is telling about where she's been living, her history. She's now she starts to tell about the divorce and what happened to her son, because the daughter already moved away. So she tells about divorce, separation, and about her son. And I know, for some reason, she's speaking Swedish, and you don't understand Swedish. So, but I thought, as this also is a methods seminar, so I thought, okay, let's start with the sound file, and with the transcription of the audio aspects, and then add on video, in order to, because I think you will discover quite quickly that using video adds a quite new dimension to the interview. So now I'm going to play the sound file, and you won't understand it, but I will show you a transcript. But listen to the rhythm. Don't try to understand it. Listen to the rhythm.
Vi bodde där. Vi separerade och sen hade vi olika. Han kom till mig och sen var det så tungt. Och sen körde vi ett tag. Ja.
So if you notice, there's a certain rhythm when she's talking. Okay, so let's look at the transcript. She says, well, my son lives with his father, and we all live there. And I said, And we separated, and then we had different, he came to me, and then it was empty. And my colleague says, yes, and Laura continues. And then my colleague interferes and says, alternate residence. We did this for a while. And this, in Swedish, this is a very sort of common expression. Because divorce and for children to live in divorced families, I think affects 50% of all Swedish children. I think that's the number. So it's quite sort of culturally embedded concept. Everyone knows it. And the reason my colleague uses the phrase alternate residence is because she thinks that Laura couldn't find the word. So that's the reason. And this is overlapping speak. Now, if we add one further aspect to this transcript, namely pauses, and I used audio computer program in order to measure pauses, you will see that there's a number of pauses. Almost after each line, you will see, well, my son, and then there's 1.5 seconds, next time 2 seconds, and so on and so forth. And if you've ever been interested in pauses, in conversational interaction, you know that a pause that exceeds 0.5 seconds is something that is noticeable. It's something you could, may have to account for. So, and as you can see, there's a lot of pauses here. And that's sort of not what would be expected. And you can also see, if you look at each line, you can see that each line ends with a small pause, and that each line represents a kind of idea. That's, you know, she's saying one thing on every, at least she tries to say one thing on every line, and it ends with a pause. In this connection, a quite long pause, and it goes on. And these pauses, remember those, because I think they're quite interesting. So, now, what I would like to argue is that, in a way, her story, or her telling about what happened to herself and her son, in many ways is incomplete. We have the pauses, but we also have a lot of words that are indexical. They're sort of referring to things. There, then, he, it. And she's not specifying what she's thinking about. She's not specifying who he is, or when, then, was, and so on. Sort of, in a way, it seems to be taken for given. And then, if we look at every line, we can sort of think that she wanted to continue. We separated and then, and you can see and then. You can see it all over. And then. That's typical for storytelling. And then, and then, and then, and then. So, but you never knew what happened. It's like it is aborted in a way. And this happens in all over the interview with her. It's not just here, it's sort of frequent, the same pattern. And if you have worked with people with aphasia or people with dementia, you will recognize this sort of as a well-established pattern. It's like it starts, but it never ends. That's the problem. So, it's frequent, there are long pauses, and the grammatical constructions are never complete. It's not just a question about words, but it's the way the words are combined, the grammatical constructions. In a way, utterances are syncretic. They're sort of like images, and I will come back to that idea again. So, this is how far you can get with an audio. You could add phonology, which I didn't do. I'm not good at that, but you could do it. You could hear that she stressed the word father, for instance, and the more phonological aspects. But But the point is that if you look at the video, you will see that there is a completely different dimension to her storytelling in this short sequence. And I'm going to play the video. She's still speaking in Swedish, so don't listen too much. Listen to the rhythm and watch her hands. See if it works.
Ja, min son bor hos sin pappa. Och vi bodde där. Vi separerade och sen hade vi olika. Han kom till mig och sen var det så tomt. Ja. Och sen körde vi på ett tag. Ja.
At this video sequence in more detail. And we're going to look at gestures, eyes, and partly body posture as well. So if we start from the beginning, this is a default position. When people sort of are not doing anything in particular, they are generally in a default position. You can observe it all the time when people are sitting around tables or in lecture halls. They're sort of sitting, doing nothing. That's a default position. And her default position in this sofa is having the hands in her lap. So, and you can also see that when she starts to talk, she's looking at me sitting over here. She's in a way, and we can't see it, but you have to believe me when I'm saying it. I'm looking at her. So, in a way, we sort of establish a shared space between us. And you will see that everything that happens when she actually make her gestures are happening, so to say, inside this shared space. She's not starting to do things out here or out here. She's sort of doing things in a tri-dimensional space. You have to imagine it here. And she is also using her middle of her body as a midline, and you will see that soon. So, when she starts, she says, "Well, my son," and then there's a slight pause. "He lives with his father, and we all live there." And when she says, "We separated," then her hands goes up. We separate. Sort of goes from the middle of her body out to both sides. We separated. Something was split up. And then there is we separated, and then, and then. And when she's saying that, and the phrase "and then," that's a sort of a transition. And then the next thing happens. So it's a transition. And so when she says, and then her hand comes back like this, in a kind of semi-default position. She's not separated anymore, she's sort of waiting for and then. And that's also quite common, because we know in advance when we are going to use gestures, we sort of, before we do it, a fraction of a second before we're going to make a gesture, we sort of put our hands and arms in position in order to do it quickly, synchronized with the talk. So she's sort of, if we saw that, we could think and expect that there are more gestures to come. And then we had different, and then there are again outward hand movements with the palms up. So. He came to me, and she's probably talking about her son, and then she's doing, he came to me, and she's taking her right hand into the midline again of her body, keeping the other hand sort of, that's separation still, but he came, and then he goes back to his father, the other hand goes out again, sort of. So that this is constant movement, going back, coming, leaving, going back to father. And at that point, she also shifts her gaze from me to my colleague, and my colleague also says yes, and her shift of the gaze slightly ahead of the yes. She probably saw Linda preparing to say yes, and slightly changes her gaze, directs it to Linda. That's my colleague. So when the son leaves again back to his father, it's empty, and she had taken her right hand in. Now the left hand goes in. It's empty. Nothing there when she's alone. And then there's a new movement, and she goes back to a default position. So, and she shifts the gaze back to me. She moves her head slightly. So what we actually get is this full transcription with both gaze and gestures, and you can see there's a lot of things going on, and we can also see that when there are pauses, that's when sort of the gestures appears. It seems like she starts using words, but at the finish of the utterances, she can't sort of find something. So, and that's where the gestures come in. So if we sum up this analysis, and you can of course see nothing of her use of gestures, we were not able to see that in the audio transcription. Sort of, it wasn't there. All we could see in the audio transcription was something that we could guess and argue were quite incomplete. But adding the visual aspect of the interaction, we can sort of see that she's actually doing quite a lot of things. And we can see that her gestures, her hand gestures, take on some of the functions of words, and we can also see that her gestures are seamlessly integrated into her talk. So there's not first talk and then a small pause and then gestures. It's like that talk and gestures sort of are simultaneously organized and sort of seamlessly come out from her body. And it's also important, I think, to actually note that she's not substituting single words. It's rather quite complex linguistic constructions aimed at expressing events, namely the son. Well, first we divorced and moved to separate housings or livings, apartments, and then the son, he has been going back and forth, and I've been quite lonely certain times. That, in a way, what I think she's trying to say. So it's not just that it's one word missing or two words. It's much more. It's sort of words and combination of words, grammatical constructions that actually can express events, things happening, coming and going, moving, etc. Yes. So the gestures are as complex, actually, as the intended linguistic constructions. And if you look closely at the gestures she's making and the way she's using her body, her midline of the body, and the way she describes divorcing, coming and going, and leaving her empty, her home empty, it seems that she are connecting to a kind of experiences that I think we could think of in terms of embodied experiences. It's patterns of movement, people coming, going, splitting up, leaving someone alone, and so on. It's a kind of embodied experiences that are not just an abstract fact, but something that she actually are able to express by using her body and expressing these movements and these events. So in a way she uses her gestures and I would argue her embodied experiences of both the divorce and the moving away and also the son coming and going as a kind of pattern of embodied movements that she actually experienced. In a way, it's also a fact that the gestures are what's generally called syncretic. That is, they are holistic. They are like an image, a vision. Everything is there in one movement. You can see it. But if you're going to use language, you need to do something that you don't need to do when you may use gestures. Language is analytic and sequential. You have to sort of put everything in a certain sequence, and you have to put a word on every simple thing you want to say. When you're using gestures, it's like an image, a vision. You can sort of hold everything together in one holistic movement. So, in a way, what seems to happen is that Laura has severe problems going from parts of her remembered movements, her remembered experiences, to analyzing these experiences in such a way that they would be possible to express them in a sequential, analytical manner, that is, by using words. And she has also evidently problems with finding those words. So instead, she uses syncretic, holistic gestures. And in a way, and you could think of this is also very common among people with aphasia, dementia. They sort of start to use gestures instead of language. And in a way, what they are quite successful in doing that is sort of, they are staying on in the ongoing conversation, but they are losing something. They are losing some of the analytic clarity that we sort of gain when we use language. So that's what she loses in shifting her semiotic means. So, in conclusion, I would argue that this example and many examples like this example are indications that memories are not representations that are stored in an archive in the brain. It's rather bits and pieces of embodied experiences and patterns, movements, some of them motoric, as it apparently was in this case, that persons can recreate and use in taking part in conversational interaction, in talk about memories, about things that happen, and recreate these memories in new situations. So I also think that this example indicates that experiential fragments, memories, are not mapped into linguistic expressions. But what happens when we sort of start to talk about things that we in some way experience that they have happened, is rather that our memories are developed, they're fulfilled when we sort of put them into some kind of semiotic tools. There are certain things that happens when we put memories into language. Our memories become very sequential and analytical. And there are other things that happen when we use gestures and body language in general. Then the wholeness or the syncretic aspects of the memories are sort of highlighted. And finally, I don't think that dementia or other kinds of brain diseases lead to neither erasure of memories or necessarily problems of retrieving memories, but rather to a loss of certain possibilities, the possibilities to use certain semiotic systems like language. And that in turn leads to invention of new communicative possibilities, like the use of gestures, or if I had another hour, I could play you a quite interesting video of a person in a very advanced stage of dementia that started to sing and move along with the body. and she was everyone thought she was, you know, close to death, beyond everything. And it seems like, you know, engaging people in interaction, engaging people in joint activities, doing things together, sort of opens up possibilities for persons with dementia to actually find new ways to express themselves and to use new communicative possibilities. So, and I also hope I sort of presented an argument for the necessity to use video, because if we just had stayed with the audio, we had missed, you know, 75–80% of the communication. If, you know, you can't say it's 75%, but you get my idea.
Could you play again?
Ja, min son bor hos sin pappa. Och vi bodde där. Vi separerade och sen hade vi olika. Han kom till mig och sen var det så tungt. Och sen körde vi ett tag så. Ja.
So that was the end.